Buenas noches para todos las personas que están conectadas. Muchas gracias por participar. Eh, Vamos a hacer la transmisión directamente por Facebook Live. Eh, entonces, les agradecemos. Hemos compartido el link en el chat de este grupo. Les agradecemos que les comuniquen a las personas que ustedes sepan que se quieren conectar, pues que por favor nos acompañen vía Facebook para que tengamos una mayor capacidad de gente conectada. Las personas que estén en este momento, pues no hay problema en que puedan permanecer, pero sí les agradecemos que inviten a todos sus conocidos a que se conecten vía Facebook. Ya voy a volver a compartirles el link para las personas que no lo han visto.
Hi, Ryan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Welcome, man.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Clover should be in the line. Clover is acting as the president of the Colombian Association of Geologists and Geophysicists, of Petroleum Geologists and Geophysicists. He's a longtime friend. Let me introduce you to him. Hi, Clover. Say hello to Ryan.
Thank you very much, Albert. Hi, Brian. How you doing?
I'm well. Yourself?
I'm locked down, but I'm good. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Thank you very much for joining us, Ryan, tonight. It's a pleasure to listen to you.
Of course. Thank you guys for accommodating my schedule. I know it's probably a little bit later.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
We're more than happy to listen to you. This is a very interesting topic for us in Colombia. During this time, we are discussing a lot of things about hydraulic fracturing here and how to realize this kind of projects. So it's good to listen to you and what you're thinking about this.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Should I wait up to start, or what's the plan?
Yes, we are waiting a couple minutes just to give access to more people. We are making a Facebook Live also from our account. And at the first, I will give some introduction to our associates about the activities from the Colombian Association. Just 2 or 3 minutes, and after that, you can start with your talk.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. Do you want to make some tests about the screen sharing from you?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just quickly see if I can share up my presentation.
Please.
Oh, it says host is disabled screen sharing.
Let us solve that in a sec.
Hey man, are you at the top of the universe?
Well, at least actually.
I think there's a setting that has to be changed before I can share my presentation or even test it.
Yeah,
you're on it?
It's about making you a co-host now.
Okay.
Make it.
Think that you are not a host now. Yes, that's right.
Okay, cool. So that can be seen, hey?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect. And you can see my pointer too, eh?
That's right.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I should probably give screen sharing back to you guys though, or you had a thing that you had up?
Yeah, but I think that we are at 7 o'clock, so let's start this.
Okay, I'm turning my camera off now.
Just give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay, now you're seeing my screen, right?
You bet.
Okay. I'm sorry, Ryan, I'm going to speak in Spanish just to make some announcements, okay?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. That's fine. Thank you. Yeah.
Flower, no se te escucha.
Aló, ahí me escuchan.
Sí, ahora sí.
Listo. Gracias. Bueno, muy buenas noches para todos. Bienvenidos a la última conferencia del día de hoy. Bastante interesante. Esperamos que la disfruten bastante. Estamos transmitiendo directamente desde nuestro Facebook Live. Pueden entrar a Facebook y teclear ACGGP y nos encuentran rápidamente para que puedan estar conectados. Solo voy a hacer algunos anuncios para conocimiento de todos ustedes que ojalá puedan ser de su interés. Básicamente, contarles que nuestra junta directiva de ACGGP está más que activa, trabajando fuertemente de la mano con el staff administrativo para desarrollar estrategias y líneas de acción para este periodo de trabajo. Como ustedes han visto, hemos desarrollado muchas actividades y estamos planeando muchas otras. Entonces, los invitamos a seguir conectados con nosotros, a rodear a esta junta directiva y que ojalá pues todos puedan tomar provecho de las actividades que estamos preparando. Como ustedes saben, pues esta es la última conferencia del día de hoy. Mañana vamos a tener 2 conferencias a las 11 de la mañana y a las 4 de la tarde y vamos a cerrar a las 6 de la tarde con un conversatorio que ya les voy a contar. Tenemos una programación confirmada hasta el 19 de mayo. Me disculpan que no he actualizado esta pieza y pueden contactarme a cualquiera de estas redes sociales o correo electrónico si alguno de ustedes quiere ofrecer alguna conferencia. O si también quieren tener el cronograma y no lo han encontrado en redes, pues también me pueden escribir. Los invito a seguir las redes sociales de ACGGP, de Sociedad Colombiana de Geología, de la Universidad Nacional, porque allí estamos publicando toda la información. Bueno, como esta noche tenemos programadas varias conferencias técnicas, vamos a escuchar a Ryan Schultz ahorita que yo termine y la próxima semana quiero invitarlos a una conferencia con Héctor Alfonso bastante interesante que se llama Todo lo que quiso saber sobre exploración sísmica y nunca se atrevió a preguntar. Ojalá puedan participar porque realmente que es de mucho interés para todos. Y ojalá podamos invitar a muchos profesionales que trabajen en la industria de tal forma que más personas puedan tener acceso a este tipo de información y de conocimiento, ¿por qué no? Y contarles que estamos preparando para el 21 de mayo a las 6 de la tarde un conversatorio sobre el rol de las mujeres en la industria de los hidrocarburos, también bastante interesante. Va a estar moderado por la tesorera de nuestra junta directiva, Mayra Vargas, y esperamos contar con unas invitadas de lujo, por supuesto. Entonces los invito a que reserven en su agenda el 21 de mayo a las 6 de la tarde. Y también contarle que estamos realizando los preparativos para ofrecer un nuevo curso técnico virtual de entrenamiento, en esta ocasión enfocado en Wellbore Stability, bastante interesante este tema, ofrecido por Sandra Montoya de Ecopetrol. Ella es profesional en geomecánica, entonces tiene muchísima experiencia. Lo estamos programando para tener una duración de 8 a 10 horas y estamos pensando programarlo para finales de mayo. Entonces les pedimos estar muy atentos de las fechas para que se inscriban. Contarles de las actividades que estamos haciendo en el marco en la campaña Ciudad Geológica en Casa, que es una campaña bastante interesante que estamos haciendo y liderando desde la Asociación Colombiana de Geólogos y Geofísicos del Petróleo. El propósito es sencillamente divulgar el conocimiento en ciencias de la Tierra con muchas personas. Entonces los invitamos a que visiten el canal en YouTube que tenemos, que se llama ACGGP. Ustedes entran a YouTube, teclean ACGGP y así nos encuentran y puedan conocer estos videos que hemos preparado, pero también los invitamos a que los compartan con sus familiares, con sus amigos, con personas que ustedes consideren que pueden disfrutar bastante de este material y que ojalá pues quieran empaparse un poco de las maravillas de las ciencias de la Tierra que nosotros estudiamos. Como les decía, mañana viernes 8 de mayo a las 6 de la tarde vamos a tener esta conferencia que va a tratar sobre los retos que tiene la generación actual. Va a estar liderado por nuestros estudiantes de los capítulos estudiantiles de la asociación y de la Sociedad Colombiana de Geología y va a estar, digamos que moderado por Laura Becerra, que es secretaria de nuestra junta directiva. Entonces los invitamos a que se unan, a que participen, a que compartan sus ideas, sus opiniones y cómo podemos empujar e impulsar a estas generaciones que tienen tanta energía y tantas ganas por trabajar con nuestro gremio. Bueno, sin más preámbulos, solo quiero recordarles que pues el audio y el video permanezca apagado para que la conferencia transite lo mejor posible. Y agradecerles a todos por estar conectados. Estamos transmitiendo en Facebook. Vamos a estar muy pendientes de las preguntas que ustedes hagan para hacérselas llegar a Ryan. Y bueno, un inmenso placer de verdad que nos acompañen en esta noche. Y muchas gracias. Voy a hacer una muy sencilla introducción de Ryan para que podamos empezar con su conferencia. Ryan, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to listen to you. I'm just going to make some introduction about you. I hope not making any mistake on that.
Okay.
Ryan studied physics and completed a master's degree in geophysics at the University of Alberta, where he was also a researcher for a couple of years. He worked as a seismologist at the Alberta Geological Survey for around 8 years. And currently he's pursuing his second year of a PhD at Stanford University. So Ryan, thank you very much again for being here. And this is your moment. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you kindly for the introduction. Some of the stuff that I'm interested in talking about today is my prior work that I did looking at induced seismicity, specifically related to hydraulic fracking in Alberta. For those that aren't familiar with where Alberta is, that's up in Canada. So Alberta is kind of like the Texas of Canada, where the majority of the oil and gas is located. So maybe correspondingly, that's part of the reason why we also had some of these induced earthquakes. I'll give the talk in a series of punctuated in a bunch of different portions of this. So I'll be looking at some of the cataloging or building the earthquake catalog that we've done back home in Alberta. The cases of induced seismicity, most specifically looking at the frac related cases that we've had. We've had a number of cases related to a whole bunch of different causes. Looking at some of the triggering mechanisms or some of the conceptual understanding of how these induced earthquakes work, both from the operational perspective. So what kind of gears and knobs can you turn if you're the operator causing these earthquakes, and also the geological implications. So what sort of situations are more or less likely to bump into these types of earthquakes, and what kind of inferences we can make from this, as well as maybe mention some ongoing work or completed work that I didn't feel like I quite had the time to sneak into this presentation as well. In doing all this work, the basic most important unit that you can get is the seismic station. A lot of the equipment that we had installed or I had installed up in Alberta was related to nanometrics broadband stations, specifically Trillium compacts. These are all telemetered using satellite dishes as well as solar panels to make them completely autonomous in whatever region. And we've been installing these things in this region ever since the induced seismicity started happening to try and get coverage that previously wasn't in this area. So here's just a map of some of the recent station coverage that's been installed in the area of Alberta, operated by a number of different jurisdictions, universities, agencies. We've got the University of Alberta with a number of stations, Western University, McGill, all operating stations and sharing that data with each other to build this catalog. We've also done some work to try and quantify how well the catalog is performing. And so because this region, Alberta, isn't really well known for seismicity, we can't use a lot of the techniques to capture what the magnitude of completeness actually is using empirical methods where you just look at the catalog itself. So we've had to use other methods like looking at the ambient noise. So you can take these long records, the continuous waveforms that will be recorded over a period of years, and you can get a sense of what the spectral noise will be for each of these. And you can accumulate a whole number of these things and build them into something like a probability density function, a PDF, and get a sense of what the noise level is based on a frequency band If we also know spectral characteristics of what an earthquake might look like, so we can combine these two things to get a sense of what the detection thresholds might be for each individual station based on the distribution of noise that these stations are encountering. And so this was a synthetic example of some of the early days where we're trying to estimate what that magnitude of completeness was, to basically try and direct where we should be installing more stations if we compare that to areas where there's very low detection threshold, and corresponding that to areas that are also potentially interesting to study, induced earthquakes or whatever interesting seismicity is going on. Don't want to labor that too much because that's not really the meat of what I want to talk about. But installing these new stations and getting a sense of how well it performs has given us an ability to catalog and cluster a lot of the seismicity that's been going on in the province. So for everyone when I had mentioned before, Alberta's here up in Canada. We've had in this area, the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, a series of clusters that have all been in one way or the other related to some sort of oil and gas operation. So up in Horn River Basin here, this was in 2011, there was induced seismicity related to fracking. Same with the Montney, more or less starting, I think it was around 2014. There's this cluster near Fort St. John. This has been related to secondary recovery. The cases I'm going to focus in on most closely is here, the CLS one. This is related to ongoing seismicity near Fox Creek. They're fracking the Duvernay Formation in this area. There's also been a case related to disposal starting back in the 90s in the Cordell field. This Rocky Mountain House seismogenic zone has been going back to the 70s, and it's been ongoing right up until today. That's been related to secondary recovery, as well as the Cardston swarm here in southern Alberta, related to a play that they initially started fracking for a little while, but industry kind of eventually lost interest in this. And so there's been a number of publications detailing some of these sequences and the ongoing seismicity within them. And so this kind of repeats a lot of what I've said with links to some of the papers that have detailed these previous sequences. But what we're most going to be interested in is some of the sequences that have been going on near Crooked Lake, which is near Fox Creek, related to fracking of the Duvernay Formation. Okay, so what's shown here in this map is very similar. This is just now giving the outline of the Duvernay Formation itself. So this is the target formation of the fracking that's been going on. What was immediately interesting about all the earthquakes within this little cluster here is that if we look at the history of seismicity in this area and we truncate it based on our previous understanding of what the magnitude of completeness should be in this basin, we see that the earthquakes have been going on at a steady rate for a period of decades. Eventually, in around 2010, the operators start fracking this formation. And it's not until another approximately 3 years later, in December of 2013, that we see a sudden change in the rate of the earthquakes that have been going on in this area. And so in 2013, it was pretty well known that induced earthquakes have been a thing. So this prompted some of the investigation or scientific interest in this area. And specifically, actually, this one earthquake was one of the more important events. The earthquake that happened on January 23rd of 2015 was a magnitude 3.8. This one was notable because this was one of the first events that was large enough to be felt in a nearby town here, the Fox Creek. Just a quick estimates of what we had put together for shake maps was consistent with the fact that this would probably be felt in the town of Fox Creek itself. And it also prompted the regulator to put in a traffic light protocol in this area to manage these earthquakes. And so what was put in this area was a traffic light protocol where green, you're allowed to operate and frack as you see fit up to a magnitude 2. When you get up to the magnitude 2, you're in yellow light territory. You have to enact some sort of mitigation strategy to make sure that you don't go up in magnitude up to the magnitude 4 level, which is the red light. That's the point where the regulator steps in and stops operations. In this area, there's been 2 red light cases that have happened to date. So building on this, we've taken a look and built a catalog in this area based on all of the information that we could get that was publicly available. And we're fairly confident, or very confident, that these things are related to fracking based on essentially looking at spatial temporal associations. So one of the things that we see that's, I'm focusing in on just one specific case here right now, where the gray bars are showing the amount of volume that's being used per stage during the injections. And so this blue area is just highlighting essentially the entire stimulation time that one well has been operating, and then all of the earthquakes that associate with it. And so what we see in a lot of these cases is that the earthquakes happen very vigorously during the stimulation phase, and then after you stop operations, the earthquakes slow in rate and magnitude and eventually taper off with time. We can also look a little bit more rigorously at these sorts of associations, and we can look at something like the cumulative number of earthquakes versus the injected volume that's put in. We can put in nice straight line relationships between this, as you would essentially expect from previous works on how induced seismicity might be related to the injection process, or injection related induced seismicity, as well as you can look at something like the cumulative seismic moment that's going out versus the injected volume that's been put in place. So just from a timing of the earthquake's point of view or perspective, we have very good constraints that these are related to fracking itself. And we can also use additional association techniques based on cross-correlation reshuffling tests to get statistical confidences on the relationship between these things. And they're almost always greater than 99.7%. So you're sort of typical 3 sigma confidence. So I just showed for one case here, but this has been repeated for a whole number of cases. This is essentially the same sort of thing that you see in essentially every frac related case, is that the earthquakes happen most vigorously for one cluster during the stimulation period, and then tapers off with time. And it's associated essentially just with one pad, the nearest pad in the area. And so that's like sort of segues into the next thought is what's the spatial association with these sorts of earthquakes. And we see that if you cluster the earthquakes based on looking at something like waveform similarity to get a sense of where they should be, as well as double difference relocate the events, we see a consistent trend where I've colored different or used different symbols for every single different cluster of event of earthquake. So all of the orange diamonds here are shown by 1, and they're all occurring right on top of the pad, at least to the scale of resolution that we think we're confident that we have with the network in the area at this time. So we're seeing, I guess what I'm trying to say here essentially is that this is the size of the error ellipsoid, or that's what we think is going on with this particular case. But this here is from a regional perspective. I mentioned to you before that there's been 2 red light cases so far in this area. And what's interesting about red light cases is when that happens, the operator has to submit their data. They're required to monitor and have an understanding of what's going on for induced seismicity in this area. Part of this first traffic light protocol that was put in place, the operator has to submit their data. So there's 2 cases here, a red light case that happened down here, as well as a red light case that happened up here, where we have denser local array data that we can scrutinize these cases a little bit closer. So this is the June 23rd of 2015 case. That was that first red light case that I had mentioned. The operator had a surface array in place that they had shared 8 stations roughly within a 3-kilometer circular radius from their pad. And in doing double difference relocations of these events, what we had been able to find is that the cluster of events where the earthquake was, the magnitude 4 earthquake that had happened occurred on this essentially north-south trending, more or less sub-vertical fault structure. So this is showing a map view plot of that. And then the earthquakes have been color-coded according to which cluster they're in. And you can see that the events tend to trend somewhere between the target formation, the Duvernay here, and the basement interval here. That's seen for these three clusters, as well as in this case here, which is the second red light event that we had that happened in January 12th of 2016. So we're seeing something very consistent with this. Since this though, however, there has been more recent updates to both the velocity model as well as more industry shared data in this area. And they've essentially updated this swarm of events to push it just a little bit shallower, maybe a couple 100 meters, with essentially the same sort of structure. We're still seeing this sort of north-south orientation, subvertical faulting in this area. We also put together moment tensors for all of these events in this area, and they're all showing a remarkable consistency, which is maybe to be expected. All these clusters, one of the important features that we noticed between all the clusters is that they essentially appear to be very similar, almost repeating like events. So they have these very high correlation coefficients within their clusters. So much so that this is almost, or is one of a good screening criteria that we've used to identify some of these cases. And so all of these events are showing these strike slip style events, which is more or less consistent with the regional stress field, which has SH max oriented at 45 degrees. So it's consistent with that type of, that style of fault activation. As well as the stress regime that's already been characterized by some of the injection test data that's been provided by operators. So based on building this catalog and looking at just the results of this, one of the things that we were interested in coming up with was a story or the implications for what sort of mechanism is triggering these types of events. And so there's two possible cases. You can either have an operator fracking their well stage by stage, and you have fluid migration going along the stimulated fractures, and it's not until you happen to hydraulically connect with a fault that pore fluid increases the pore pressure within the fault, allowing that slip to happen by changing or reducing the effective normal stress. The other potential scenario you could have is essentially just a change in mass and volume in the area poroelastically changes the stress conditions. And so you could have, hypothetically, another fault that's situated away from the wellbore itself that isn't in direct hydraulic communication with this, that could be stimulated to the failure condition just by the changing of fault loading conditions. Based on some of the things that we've seen, I personally prefer or favor this sort of mechanism. The starting point is by looking at something like this, essentially, right? We've seen a number of these cases where we have direct connection of the fault itself right into the wellbore itself. So it's very plausible just thinking that there could be some sort of, or that there would be a connection between the fractures themselves and the fault itself. So that's one piece. But there also are these interesting cases that we've seen where we're getting communication at further distances, sometimes up to 1.5 kilometers away. So it starts to stretch a little bit of the imagination with this. One of the other supporting pieces for this is some geomechanical work that a colleague of mine has done, where they've essentially looked at if you increase the pore fluid pressure up to levels near the frac gradient, what sort of orientations of faults are going to be favorable for slip in this state. And so these are just shown with some of the orientations of fault, that north-south near subvertical, starting to be having a potential to slip or being very favorable for slip. But when you even go up to levels near the frac gradient, you have the potential to activate a series of even unfavorable, typically unfavorably oriented faults, just because of the magnitude of pore fluid pressure increases that you could have. There's also been recent studies that have been suggesting maybe some sort of complexity in the slip mechanism or the initiation of earthquakes. And so this is a recent paper by the University of Calgary, where they've suggested potentially that because the Duvernay itself is a shale, and a lot of the rate and state parameters that you would expect for shales tend to favor stable slip initiation on that. So maybe there's a scenario where there's a direct communication to the fault itself, and this initiates stable sliding in this area, creeping motion, but it's not until you get up to the more of the carbonate, stiffer, more competent rocks that you get these sort of dynamic slip or earthquake type motions in this area. So this is another potential mechanism that could be going on, where you have kind of a cascade of events: stimulation, fault, aseismic slip, up to the actual dynamic slip at a different region of that same particular fault. So that's one piece related to the implications for the triggering mechanism. One of the next things that we were interested in looking at was what sort of controls does the operator have once you're in an area where you start getting these earthquakes. So we can start leveraging a data set that we've put together, that same data set. We have a sense in this area of all of the wells that have been operating, and the wells that have caused earthquakes here, I've just shown bolded, corresponding also to the earthquake clusters that I had shown before, and the grayed out wells that have not caused earthquakes. And so we can start looking at some of the questions that might arise from this. So as I mentioned here, one of the big questions, at least in my mind initially, was why did it take roughly 3 years for earthquakes to start happening in this area when we've been fracking since 2010, but it's not until 2013 that we actually started getting the earthquakes. So just in this plot here, I'm showing the sequences of earthquakes with the red dots, as well as the stimulated volumes per stage wise, shown by the gray bars, and then the average, a running average of the amount of volume that they've used in a pad. And so this is showing pretty typical behavior of what you might expect for a maturing shale play, where they're kind of exploring the area, getting more and more volume put in per pad, increasing that at a time. And it's not until the regulation goes in place that says you need to monitor what's going on, that volume begins to taper off or plateau, and it's not until the first red light case that the volumes changed in the area. But we can look a little bit more rigorously at what might be controlling these things. So we're in a fortunate situation where the operators have to report for every single well that they have, by stage, the amount of volume that's been put into the well, or sorry, the amount of volume that's been put into that stage. So the amount of fracking fluid, as well as the wellhead pressure, as well as the rate, the average rate that they've used. And so just looking at this from a purely statistical point of view, we can look at all the wells that have caused or have been associated with earthquakes, shown in red, versus all of the wells, period, shown by the gray distribution. And we can start doing, just looking at the differences between these distributions, we can start doing statistical tests to see if there's any difference. So we can look at the effect of what pressure has done to encounter in seismicity, yes or no, as well as the effect of rate or volume. And we can do this on a stage by stage basis. We can do this on a well by well basis, or we can do it on a pad by pad basis. And so the statistics that come out of this show that essentially rate and pressure, the red and black distributions show no statistical difference between each other. I can't discern any difference between these two things. But it's when we look at volume that we actually do see a very strong statistical difference. And we can do all sorts of robustness sensitivity tests to slice and dice this, and we get the same result. And in fact, you can really actually just eyeball this relationship here. You can see that the red wells that did cause earthquakes tend to be higher volumes than the black ones that did not cause earthquakes. So that's at least a starting point here, but we can again be more rigorous for this, and we can come up with a bit of an explanation potentially as to why, what sort of operational controls there are. And so there's been previous models to get a sense of what's going on with induced seismicity. So Serge Shapiro's model, they've put together a seismogenic index-based model where you modify the Gutenberg-Richter frequency, magnitude frequency distribution to change this A term into a term something like this, and you get a modified version that looks something like this, where you have the number of earthquakes that you're drawing from your distribution has something to do with the amount of volume that you put in here. And so this is interesting because this potentially explains why these higher volume wells have been more likely to encounter induced seismicity, simply because the more volume you put in, the more number of earthquakes you get. The more number of earthquakes you get, the more likely you are to have a big event, essentially. And so we can, again, statistically test for this. If we look at all of the volume that's been put into the Duvernay, just as a function of the size, the cumulative count of the number of events, if we look at that, we actually initially don't get a very good fit to the data. We have significant biases either trending above, then below this relationship. So this is a fairly poor fit to this. And this is a little bit troubling because, as I had showed you before, when we look at a single pad at a time, we can build these beautiful linear relationships between injected volume and some sort of seismic parameter. So this, in my opinion, is telling us something. That volume isn't the only feature that's controlling these induced events. Not to say that it isn't controlling it in some way, because there's clearly been this statistical relationship where we're seeing that higher volumes tend to encounter earthquakes, but there's also been very high volume cases that have not caused earthquakes. So one of the things that we did to fix this, essentially, is filter this out to only include wells that have already been associated with induced seismicity, and then do this relationship again, and we see a significant improvement in the goodness of fit to this. So we're essentially counting, if we filter for some sort of spatial effect that, let's say, we don't understand quite yet, as well as the volume that's being put in, we essentially capture 96% of what's going on in this sort of space here. So the next question then is, so what is this spatial bias? Or what's driving it? What's causing it? One of the, I guess, null or not interesting things that it could be is maybe it's just some sort of detection problems with your network. Maybe you're only catching it in one area versus another. We've done a series of tests that I won't go into in this talk here, but we're fairly confident that we've discounted that idea. The second piece comes in previous studies that we've already done here, is we've seen that the spatial locations of where induced seismicity has been encountered in Alberta has been biased to certain locations. So for example, here we did a paper where we've shown that all of the induced seismicity that's going on in Alberta, so these Fox Creek events, as well as that Brazeau, that disposal case, the Rocky Mountain House cluster that was going back to the 70s, secondary recovery related, all essentially silhouette this formation that underlies the Duvernay. And so this here is related to, this is a carbonate formation. So this is a reef. And a lot of the edge of this reef has been associated with structural controls that have influenced the depositional setting, and that the reef tends to nucleate in areas where there's been some sort of fault-related effects. So in maybe a very high-level way, essentially what this could be interpreted as is a relationship between faults as well as the reef structure. So maybe in that sense, it's not surprising that you would expect to have the induced seismicity trending along this. I mean, we've seen that also as well doing statistical tests on this, essentially Monte Carlo simulations of this to get a sense that this isn't an accident either. that there is some sort of statistically significant bias to these sorts of locations. We can do that with something like proximity to this reef. We can also do this with other indicators, such as the pressure gradient in situ in the Duvernay Formation. And we found that areas of the Duvernay that are highly overpressured, i.e. closer to critically stressed faults, tend to be more likely to encounter induced seismicity, again, in a statistically significant way. And this isn't just for the Duvernay, this has also been seen in the Montney, and now Mike Brodzinski over at Miami University in Ohio is showing this for a couple places in Oklahoma as well. So there's some sort of biases to be for induced seismicity to occur in areas that are favorable in some way to allowing these sorts of events to occur. And so this slide here, I've kind of actually already belabored this point, but this is some of the statistical tests that we did specifically related to this here. And so one other thing that was actually really interesting about this too, is that a lot of the area of this reef formation has undergone hydrothermal dolomization. So this is, again, more inference that there's been some sort of basement-related fluid flow along these faults that's caused this change in the rock themselves, as well as we've also seen from 3D seismic now cases of transtensional structure, transtensional fault, strike slip flower structures in this area, which is again a fault structure that's very conducive to having fluid flow along it. So this kind of gives a distinction that I'm going to try and make here, or let's say argue here, that the operational controls have something to do with the rate of seismicity, and that the geology has something to do with the location of this. So this sort of susceptibility. And it's only when you have, so to encounter the induced seismicity in a given location, you first need one condition. There has to be a tectonic condition. You have to have a fault in that area. If you don't have a fault, you can't have an earthquake. The next piece is geomechanical. That fault has to be critically stressed in a given area. If it's not critically stressed or it's not oriented properly, essentially, then you're not going to have an earthquake. And then the last piece you need is this hydrological condition. So you need some way to communicate the stress, potentially through a hydraulic pathway to that fault that's ready to slip. And it's only when you have all three of these conditions at the same place at the same time that you actually get induced seismicity. And so a lot of the basins that have encountered frac-related induced seismicity have actually seen that the number of wells that encounter this type of seismicity is usually very similar, less than 1%. And by that, it's also very rare. So the idea I want to present here is that the rarity of this encountering has something to do with the rarity of all of these three things overlapping at the same place at the same time. So that's a neat idea. Is there anything that we can do to show that or demonstrate that or get some sort of inference other than what I've already shown before? And so one of the things that we've tried to do here is we've taken, we basically had everyone sat down in a room and said, in your wildest dreams, what are the list of things that you could come up with that might be an indicator or a proxy indicator for one of these three conditions for encountering induced seismicity. Of that list of things, subset that to the things that are actually publicly available that we can actually look at and start testing. Then we also at the same time have a database of the wells that did cause earthquakes and the wells that did not cause earthquakes. We can put this into a machine learning algorithm to try and classify and identify which pieces of this are more important or less important, and get a sense of what are the chances then if you drill in a particular area, what are the chances that you'll encounter induced seismicity, yes or no, in that area. And so we're calling that essentially the geological susceptibility for encountering that. And so doing that approach, we were able to come up with something like this here, building just simple maps that give a relative sense of the probability of encountering induced seismicity in an area. And what's cool about this is essentially we're seeing hot spots in the areas where they're encountering induced seismicity, both from the frac related as well as some of those previous cases related to disposal as well as secondary recovery in these areas. But this, in my opinion, isn't really the cool or real interesting intuition building part of us. What's more interesting or intuition building about this is looking at feature importance. So of all the things that we put into the model, which ones are more important or less important? So some of the things that came out of this was proximity to basement is consistently always one of the highest weighted features in this. And this is interesting because this has also been seen now also in a number of cases in the States as well, both related to fracking and disposal, where proximity to basement has something to do with this. Now, so it's not necessarily proximity to basement itself that's causing this, but it's proximity to basement is acting as a proxy for one of those other three conditions that are important for encountering induced seismicity. And so the potential interpretation here is that the closer you are to a basement, the more likely you are to bump into a fault that's basement rooted that can host an earthquake as well as support fluid flow along it. As well as we recover some of the previous things that I had mentioned here, so that the amount of overpressure in situ in the Duvernay formation is quite important. Minimum horizontal stress is important, and that's as expected for something in a strike slip regime, as well as some other factors that maybe have some interesting interpretations related to them. For example, the amount of lithium concentration was one of those in your wildest dreams. What could be related to this? And this was included because lithium concentration has been speculated as being related to, or the emplacement of it or migration of it as being related to the flow along faults. So it's interesting to see that this comes up as one of the important features in this. So all of what I've talked about for the geological portions of these induced seismicity have essentially been inferences coming from statistical models. And so maybe there's a hesitation, admittedly, to believe a lot of the inferences that can come from statistics. So is there any sort of harder evidence for these ideas of geological proxies or something else that you can look for that maybe indicates fluid flow or faulting structure in an area that might be a flag to look for induced seismicity for a certain area? And so this was part of some work that we had done looking at that Cardston cluster. So the Cardston cluster specifically was a set of earthquakes that happened in southern Alberta back in 2011 related to fracking of the Exshaw formation. We were able to get a 3D reflection seismic data set in this area to examine some of the structural and geological implications of this area. And so this line here is just showing data that came from something called lithoprobe. Lithoprobe was a study that was done in the early to late 90s, I think it was, that was essentially getting 2D reflection seismic lines in this area to get a sense of what was going on in the basement and the basin. And so what we've seen, or what has been previously studied in this area, is that there's a series of normal faults that are in the area, and just the projection of that data set onto that line here is right in this bounded box, essentially. And so we examined and looked at this 3D reflection seismic data a little bit more carefully. In this area, here's one of the wells that was very near the frac well itself, as well as the earthquakes a little bit deeper here. And here's some of the interpreted horizons in this area. The lower Exshaw here being close to the target formation itself, as well as one of the deeper Precambrian strata in the area. And what we can see at looking at each of the horizons, some of the attributes on that, specifically the curvature, is that there's, first of all, at the basement level, there's these lineations, again, some sort of north-south orienting fault that's right on top of the area where the earthquakes occurred. So that supports the sort of typical story that you can have some sort of fracking going on. There's a connection to a fault, and then earthquakes occur some distance away from it. But what was most interesting, in our opinion, or in my opinion, as well as these subcircular features here that you see at the X-Shaw formation. Looking a little bit or examining them a little bit closer, looking at the isopachs between the formation above the X-Shaw and from the X-Shaw to the basement itself, is that we see that there is an overall a thickening of the formation right where those features were occurring, and then a thinning below that formation there. And this was also reflected in the well logs from this here. We could specifically see that the thinned out formation was related to the Stettler anhydrites. So an anhydrite or a salt layer that was directly below the X-Shaw itself. So ideally, we would have drill core in that well that was coincident more or less with where the earthquakes were occurring, but we don't have that. So what we ended up doing is looking for other wells in this area that might have an analogous signature to the well logs. So we're looking for something else where we have an over-thickened X-Shaw, so more than 10 meters of the X-Shaw formation itself, as well as a thinning of the formation directly below it in those anhydrites. And there was a handful of cases where we saw this. And in those cases, what we saw in the drill core is that there was brecciation, all sorts of broken rocks in this area that we're interpreting as related to a karsting feature. And so this creates a pretty cool story of what's going on. So we have this in the geologic past. You have deposition of the anhydrites in these areas. Moving a little bit forward in time, you have faulting that allows for dissolution or fluid flow along those faults, either hydrothermally from above or maybe water coming in from below, where we have dissolution of those anhydrites. We get collapse of that through karstification. Then we have this deposition of the X-Shaw itself, where it has thicker X-Shaw. And then you get fast forward to the future, where we have a well that intentionally targets this area because of the potential for thicker pay, but encounters earthquakes because this fault then is potentially, or we have an inference that there's fluid flow along this fault. One of the ingredients that's potentially important for frac-related induced seismicity. So potentially looking for things like this, it might be a way to flag of what sort of induced seismicity, or a flag for where areas may be more or less susceptible to these types of events. So that's essentially what I wanted to cover here. I've also got a number of other works going on related to induced earthquakes that have happened in the East Shell Basin. They're part of the Duvernay Formation. Coming up with methods to define in a traffic light protocol, how do you pick your yellow and red light thresholds, as well as there's an automated now data submission process where industry has to submit their data in Alberta to something called SEISM, a database that's available now on IRIS. Of course, always happy to chat about any collaborative opportunities. With that, thanks for your attention and listening.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It was a tremendous conference. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
We have a couple of questions in the chat of this group.
Okay.
So do you want that I read it, or do you want to read it yourself?
Yeah, maybe you read it, because I'm having troubles finding where it is right now.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. So the first question is, there's any difference in terms of magnitude between the earthquakes induced by hydraulic fracturing and the earthquakes induced by wastewater disposal?
Not that I've seen in Alberta. They're actually very similar, to be honest. The cases for both frac-related and secondary recovery and wastewater disposal, the cases for the maximum magnitude that has happened has been somewhere around like low to mid fours in all of these cases. So no, essentially, we haven't seen any sort of systematic differences either in terms of the recurrence statistics or just the maximum magnitudes that occur for these.
Okay, okay, thanks. The second one is the traffic light protocol applied in Alberta is the same that is used in Oklahoma?
I don't think it's exactly the same, but they're very similar. I think Oklahoma has their cutoff at 3.5, if I'm right off the top of my head. And even Alberta, they've put in a second traffic light protocol where the red light is at 3. So there's 2, one for the Fox Creek area where it's at 4, and then 3 for the area in the new area that I had mentioned there. Yeah, so that's something though that I'm interested and have been looking at recently is how do you pick those thresholds? What does it depend upon? And one of the big things, in my opinion, that it should depend on is the amount of people in a given area. So if you're in a highly populated area, you need to have lower thresholds, and you can kind of systematically assess or quantitatively assess based on something like that, how much lower it should be, depending on what the population density is.
Okay, okay, thank you. The next one says, according to your experience, what is the safe distance to any fault to perform hydraulic fracturing jobs, minimizing risks?
Like what is the thing that an operator can do to make sure you don't get bigger earthquakes, or?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a very tricky question. I don't think that there's a silver bullet answer to that question yet. There's certainly a lot of things that operators try to do, and they've got like this standard suite of things where they'll try kind of these high level, these easier things that they can try first, and then kind of go down the list to progressively maybe more costly things that they can do. And so like one of the starting things that they often do is they'll do something like they'll just reduce the rate for one of the easier things that you can do. One of the other things you can do is you can pause that particular stage. So maybe you have like an operation where you're zipper fracking on 4 different wells, is you can just pause that one operation and start fracking a different well. One that maybe isn't connected to a fault, or you have some sense that it isn't connected to a fault, and just give that fault a little bit of time to relax and let the pore pressure bleed off into the formation. Following that, if that isn't helping, you can start skipping stages. So just entirely ignoring a couple stages, or reducing the amount of volume that you're putting in some of those stages. And then eventually, if none of that really helps, I guess the final thing you can always do is, or actually, sorry, before that, one of the other things that that's done commonly is flow back in between stages. So you stimulate the fractures, you're happy you've done your fracking for that, and then you pull back the fluid after that operation. But then the final thing that you can do essentially is just abandon that well. It's not something people like to do, but it's things that can happen. Yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. Thank you, Ryan.
Mhm.
The next one says, which is the probability of having an induced earthquake if the operation is made in a distance upper of 1 kilometer of the crystal basement?
So like I don't know what the probability change would be. For a lot of this, the operator is already restricted to the formation itself, so you don't really get to choose your depth of operation. That's not true for every type of shell target, because some of them can be over an interval of hundreds of meters. For this particular formation, we're talking about there isn't that sort of flexibility, so they're restricted by the target formation itself. So there's not a lot that they can do in terms of changing the depth to try and reduce the probability of events. That said, though, maybe to more generalize that question about distances away from the fault itself, that's a very tricky and difficult question to answer again. We've seen cases that I've showed you already here where the fault and the wellbore of the event appear to be essentially coincident with each other. Yeah, something like this. So these things are occurring right on top of each other. But I've also seen cases now where the earthquakes are somewhere on a fault that's essentially 1.5 kilometers away from the wellbore itself laterally. And because it's laterally, we're quite confident that there's not really sort of any epicentral error in this. But there has to be some sort of communication to this. So this is why it's tricky, is because you need to have some sort of understanding of what like these flow paths are in the subsurface, and quantifying and understanding that before the operator starts stimulating is very tricky. It seems like the best way to figure that out is to pump fluid into the ground and just measure if there's earthquakes. And then you must have some sort of connection.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. The next one says, sorry, is there any danger of aquifer contamination by the migration of liquids used in hydraulic fracturing through potentially seismic faults, maybe due to the secondary porosity produced by these same geological faults?
That one's outside of my expertise to comment, to be honest. Everything that I've seen for cases, the faults tend to be going downwards. In these particular cases, so we've seen 3D seismic data in these areas where there's some sort of a basement rooted fault and it's extending up and it terminates just a little bit above the target formation itself. So it seems from that highly implausible that there would be any communication even further above. But I don't know. That would be an interesting question for someone to look into. And I know there's Canadian scientists right now that are looking into answering that question.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Just another couple of questions. Have you performed tracer tests to verify connectivity between hydraulic fractures and faults?
I haven't, no. That's a really good, astute question. Yeah, there have been studies though that have shown exactly that. So up in the Horn River Basin there that I mentioned, people have done studies where they've done exactly that. They've done radioactive tracer tests, Horn River Basin being up here for context, where they've seen communication between two wells up to 1.5 kilometers away, which was super exciting to me because that's similar to the range of distances we've seen these earthquakes occurring from the wellbore itself. So there's a plausible story going on there.
Okay, thank you. The next one, maybe the question is, maybe in this study it was considered the distance of the hydraulic fracturing activity with the community?
So like, are you talking about
something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, like in terms of like the risk itself, or?
Yes, I think it is that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess. Sorry to ask you to clarify because I guess they're not your questions, but
no problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's from the perspective of just like the purely conceptual understanding of what's going on. The idea is that there's some sort of susceptibility going on in an area. Certain areas are susceptible to encountering these earthquakes. Some areas are not. And essentially that's something that's totally out of our control. There's not a lot we can do about that. It's not till you go in and start fracking in a susceptible area that the rate of earthquakes is controlled then by the operators. So the operators have some sort of sense of being able to, or in my opinion at least, influence the number of earthquakes that are going to happen based on how much fluid actually connects to the fault itself. After that, the thing that you want to consider, I think this is what the question was about, was essentially who are you going to annoy, or whose building potentially are you going to do some sort of damage to? That question has a lot to do with what sort of population density you're going to encounter in an area. So somewhere like up in Horn River Basin, there's not a lot of people going on in this area. So you could potentially build, if you wanted to put a traffic light in somewhere like this, you could use higher magnitudes versus somewhere where if you were in an area close to Edmonton, somewhere around here on this map, which is the capital of this province, Alberta, you would obviously need to have much lower thresholds just because you're closer, you're going to be more likely to be closer to someone or a community in this area. So that sort of, that risk is going to be convolved with, it's going to be a convolution of a whole bunch of different things. It's going to be the susceptibility to encountering those earthquakes in an area, then the rate and the amount of volume that's put in to get the rate, kind of get a spatial temporal idea of what an earthquake catalog could be, and then based on that, the risk has something to do with the consequence in the area. So who's in the area, and what sort of buildings are in that area and how fragile they are. I hope that answered that question. I kind of blabbed on a little bit about it, but let me know.
I think it's okay. This question comes from Facebook. It says, is it feasible to mitigate seismicity rates by reducing the water volumes that are being used to frack?
So there hasn't been any systematic studies on that. So anything I say is essentially just speculation. It seems like from the previous results that there is a relationship to volume. So that would be a good thing to test and examine, but I can't say for sure. Yeah, I think it would be very cool for someone to look into that and answer that question, though.
Okay, thank you. We have just a couple of questions, Ryan.
Yeah.
This one says, related to induced earthquakes from open pit minings, is the one induced from hydraulic fracturing weaker, which has been observed as the one that has more impacts into the subsoil, the aquifer, or environment in general?
Do you know, I don't think that there's any evidence. So in Alberta, I kind of answered a similar question to this. The different types of operations that we've seen don't seem to have any systematic differences in making stronger or weaker events. More generally, just in the literature, I don't think that's the case either, actually, because there's been fracking events that have been as large. So initially, people did say that they thought maybe fracking events were going to be smaller in their maybe scope or magnitude because they had less volume, maybe compared to something like disposal, but that hasn't panned out in reality. There's been cases as large as magnitude 5.7 related to fracking over in China, and lots of events approaching nearly magnitude 5 for frac-related induced seismicity in North America as well. As it relates to mining, I'm not sure that there would be a systematic difference, but I couldn't say, I guess. I don't think so, but.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. This question says, did you see any change in seismicity rates, Poisson distributions near the faults?
So.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think. So, oh, what was that?
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So there's not a systematic or a comprehensive map of all of the faults that exist in the basin in this area. That's actually one of the challenges in doing this from the perspective of an operator, is they don't know where the faults are. And when we're talking about something like a magnitude 4 event, the fault only has to be striking roughly 1 kilometer in length. So imaging or getting a sense of all of the faults that are about that size in an area is extremely challenging to do. So there hasn't been any systematic studies to see if there's some sort of difference in an area that there is a fault versus one where there isn't. So answering that question, there isn't essentially an answer to that. But there was something you had mentioned there as well as related to a Poisson distribution. There's been a number of studies as well as some of the work that we've done where we've shown relationships where the catalog of events related to fracking tend to be Poissonian. They don't have a very strong aftershock parameter or aftershock productivity parameter related to them. And this kind of is backed up by a lot of the fact that these cases don't tend to follow a typical main shock, foreshock, main shock, aftershock sequence. They tend to be more swarm-like in their character. So yeah, that's actually been one of the hallmark features so far of frac-related seismicity, is that they're Poissonian in a non-homogeneous sense. If you made your axis, your x-axis stretched out in volume rather than time.
Okay, thanks, Ryan.
Mhm.
The next one says, is there a correlation between activating the basement with the magnitude of the earthquake?
Well, so all of the events, at least in my mind, are probably related to basement-related faults. So we haven't been able to, we're seriously hampered by the resolution, especially in the depth access on a lot of these cases. I've shown you cases where it looks like you can see some sort of, like you can actually start to see the strike, the dipping structure of the fault. But that's only in very rare cases where we have either supplemental data or some sort of additional data to look at that. So that's sort of essentially a long-winded way of me saying we don't have the data to test that question. But it would be, yeah, very cool to see if there was some sort of systematic difference.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next one says, how was the seismic activity in the location before the activity fracturing in shore began?
Sorry, that was a change in the rates the question was related to, or?
I think so, yes.
Yeah,
maybe.
Okay. Yeah, so in a lot of these areas, Alberta's NBC is not known for seismicity at all. So that's why the first part of this presentation was essentially saying we had to build a monitoring network, because the entire province of Alberta had something like one seismic station in it before this, and now we have something like, I think between the two provinces, there's something like more than 100 stations in the area now. But you can still look at truncate this based on the magnitude of completeness in the area, and look at the prior background rate versus the change in rate. And there's some error bars in this, but it's somewhere around 100-fold increase in the rate of seismicity. And you can clearly see that by essentially this L shape happening as of 2013.
Okay, Ryan, thanks. I have another question. It says,
Yeah, fire away.
Is there any relationship between increase induced seismicity and increase in fault fluid conductivity, especially in non-active faults?
That's a story I want to sell. Yeah. Of course, all of this is interpretation and inference. I think that there's a lot of cool things that are pointing to that. The fact that we have induced seismicity going on in areas where there's always these geological proxies for fluid flow. So you're seeing cases like I showed there where there's the karsting going on. Karsting is often related to some sort of fluid flow in the subsurface. The fact that these two occurred in the exact same area is not a coincidence in my mind, as well as the fact that a lot of these earthquakes have occurred in areas around the margins of these reefs, and these reefs are already known to have some sort of influence related to dolotomization. I think is another piece of another little inference that something's going on related to fluid flow, as well as even in the cases where it seems very exceptional, like I mentioned there, where you're having earthquakes that are almost 2 kilometers away from the well itself, that you're seeing these sort of radioactive tracer studies where they're saying you can have communication between wells up to that same sort of distance.
Okay. Okay, Ryan. No, I think that this was a great Q&A session. So thank you very
great
much.
Questions. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a very interesting question here. So Ryan, no, thank you very much for being here, for joining us, and for sharing your experience and your knowledge in this very important topic, especially here in our country. So we really appreciate that you shared your time with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Have a great night. Thank you very much also to Albert to share your contact with us. Please count with ACGGP in any way you think that we can help you.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Great night to all. Muchas gracias para todos. Creo que fue una sesión bastante interesante. Mañana recuerden que tendremos conferencias desde las 11 de la mañana por este mismo canal. Entonces los esperamos a todos y bueno, que tengan muy buena noche y que descansen. Un abrazo fuerte para todos.